and that you have here the structure of language should receive exclusive attention. So that's their contention, okay? Because for them, when you think about language, you have to think of grammar. So grammar has to be taught by any of the language learners, be it the first or the second language learners or the foreign language learners. So with their contention that grammar is very important, then it should be given exclusive attention during the instruction. Okay, so what are the key features of grammar translation methods and audiolingual method? So you know that grammar translation has something to do with the clear explanation of rules with memorization and translation of text from L2 to L1 or L1 to L2. And you know that there's this focus on the different word categories or word class. You have the nouns, pronouns, and then they're translated to L2 or from L1 to L2, L2 to L1. And then for audiolingual method, there's a strong focus on the structural and phonological characteristics of language. That's why there's this high use of imitative or imitation exercises. And then it is taught in a linear manner. Okay, the grammar rule is taught in a linear manner, and which is really or heavily influenced by behavioral psychology. You have B.F. Skinner. So that's of course the imitation thing there. Okay, the imitation process. That's why this is called the army method, if you remember. Okay, and there is a focus on language forms with little focus on language functions. Okay, basically because they share. Okay, these methods under grammar-based approaches share the same notion that grammar is important, so we focus on the grammar or rules. Okay, now here is the PPP that you need to learn. I'm not sure if you were able to encounter this before and you have a detailed knowledge about this one, but here is the PPP or presentation practice production. So what are the key features? So this particular model has actually been considered as like a basis for training courses of teachers worldwide. Okay, so meaning to say it is really widely accepted. Okay, it's widely accepted by many of the scholars as well as the educators in the English language teaching field. Okay, so according to this particular model, grammar instruction consists of a structured three-stage sequence. Okay, it starts with presentation, then proceeds to practice, and then production. So if you come to think of it, it's actually the framework. Okay, it's actually like it's something like a framework that has the basic structure of a lesson. That's why it's widely accepted by many teachers, and it's followed by many teacher training courses. Okay, kasi meron siyang presentation. So as you can think of it, so presentation, there's the introduction of what? The grammatical rules. Okay, the grammatical rule or the structure to be learned. Okay, usually in the form of text like story, okay, dialogue. So that is the presentation stage. And here the goal is to make students familiarize the structure, okay, introduce and store that in their short-term memory, kasi that will be nurtured in the practice stage. So presentation is followed by a practice stage wherein it usually starts with a controlled practice. Okay, controlled practice, you can think of it as something that will really enrich, okay, the knowledge established in the presentation stage. The procedure here or the movement is from controlled practice to less controlled practice, just for students to really familiarize, okay, familiarize and then gain control of the introduced structure in the presentation stage. And of course, you have the production stage of this framework or model. So you can think of it as something that will give students opportunities to use the structure more freely. Okay, so more freely kasi production na to eh. And then the goal here is for the students to really master, okay, how to use the structure or form. Okay, the goal here is to achieve fluency. Okay, so uh, this particular model follows the claim that learning is a cognitive skill, just like any other, um, you know, process of learning something. Okay, kasi when you, for example, if you want to learn a guitar, okay, or if you want to learn how to read, or if you want to learn how to open a can, so you have to think of it. You have to think, ano bang gagawin ko? So it's highly cognitive. So these models underpin information processing and acquisition, skills acquisition models. Now, information, what does information processing say about learning? So when there is an input, okay, we store it in our short-term memory to long-term memory, and then whenever it is necessary to be used, the input is accessed for subsequent comprehension and production. So when you comprehend something or absorb something, for example, you heard a word, okay, or you heard an input, it could be an instruction, it could be a visual, okay. Yung instruction could be visual or could be textual, ha. So when you receive that, you decode it, you process it. So once it's processed in your brain, you are hopefully ready to use it for production purposes. So it starts with comprehension to production. That's why this particular model really underpins one of those models. You have the information processing, and of course you have the skills acquisition model. So this particular model believes that learning is a movement from declarative to procedural knowledge. What is declarative knowledge? Anyone could you know define procedural knowledge?
Um,
um,
Declarative.
Declarative and procedural. Okay, declarative and procedural.
I'm not sure about procedural, but I've heard. Correct me if I'm wrong. This declarative knowledge is like probably the fluency of grammar rules and the
Mhm.
language. Is that it?
Any other
Just
attempt? Any other attempt? So remember that this is still under grammar-based approach. Okay. So when you say declarative, it is your explicit knowledge about the system or about the rules. Okay. Basically, um, what are the descriptions of language? Okay. This is how you use, this is how an infinitive, or this is the form of an infinitive, that this is the structure, okay, this is you know the sequence, okay. So basically your explicit knowledge of the grammar system of a language, that's declarative, okay, meaning to say these are the things that were presented to you, okay, about the language, okay, and then you absorb it and then you learn it, it becomes your declarative knowledge. How about procedural this time?
the the way or the know how to use this the specific uh
Yes, Lebron, can you repeat it because you were breaking?
okay, so procedural knowledge is somewhat like your knowledge and how to use it. Then
Yes, okay, basically. Okay, it's the opposite of declarative knowledge. So procedural knowledge this time is your knowledge of how to really use the system or really use the rule in production um, situations, okay? And this particular underscore, okay, or the PPP models really emphasize the importance of presentation and practice. So that is why 1988 emphasized that it is through practice that the material is most thoroughly and permanently learned. Okay? Kasi nga, the first thing that they do is that students first learn the new target rules and structures through the development of conscious knowledge. When you say conscious knowledge, you really process it, okay, explicitly, because this one is noun, this one is pronoun, this one is an adverb, this one is infinitive. So when you process it, when you think about the language used, by someone, or how you use the language and an utterance, then that means that you are really cognitively processing it. Okay, so in the classroom setting, the students first learn, okay, the rules, okay, and then they store it in their short-term memory to long-term memory, and then the acquisition really involves, okay, it really involves many cognitive processes for them to really store and be able to really access that for production. Okay, so you have the practice in order for them to really gain control of the structures or forms. Kaya it is really practice is really an important part here. Okay, so what are the major inadequacies of the grammar-based approaches based on your understanding, working knowledge about it? What are the major inadequacies of or the downsides of grammar-based approaches? Mhm. Yes, Michael.
I believe that the major inadequacy of these grammar-based approaches is the mechanical aspect of these approaches. Learners will be limited to make use of the language based on how they have learned the language and how they perceive its use and usage in a particular setting. With regard to the PPP model, I assume that the production stage is partly difficult to measure on the part of the teacher because the instruction with the presence of the teacher only starts and ends in the first and second stage. It is a presentation and practice. I believe that in the production stage, the teacher could no longer see and assess whether the use and usage of the particular linguistic item taught is used correctly by the student. So overall, these grammar-based approaches, the downside of them is that they are highly mechanical and they do not promote um, freedom or liberty for students to make use of the language based on how they have learned and based on what they have learned about it. And it's highly teacher centered, and therefore learners will only depend on whatever structure, how the structure is taught by the teacher. If the teacher, if if in any case the teacher is erroneous in his or her preparation and teaching of the lesson, it might cause for on the learners end incongruency of the learning taught at the present and the learning to be expected in the future. Because for example, in elementary, an elementary teacher says, but this is how you use the structure because that's what the teacher thinks of how the structure is to be used based on her reference grammar, based on her experience being an English teacher. But if the student reaches secondary or even tertiary level, this knowledge, his or her knowledge about this particular linguistic item will be furthered, and it might reveal the downside or the erroneous aspect of the learning acquired from in the basic education or in the grade school, that will cause fusion or incongruency in the part of the students. So again, it's highly mechanical. They are highly mechanical and teacher centered.
Yes, Lebron.
So I think as what I would put also that the inadequacies of grammar-based approaches is that in teaching grammar, in teachers, the teacher teaches grammar as a set of rules and structures. They are not exploring um the other the other lesson or something like the other uh concept or ideas that will add on in meeting the communicative uh com- of meeting the communicative aspect of how to learners. So they are really focusing on grammar as a set of rules and structures. Now there's already a they are not exploring other ways. They just focus on what has been there. So pag inani na dyan lang i-teach, they are not exploring.
Okay, so basically, LeBron was saying that one of the major assumptions under the traditional grammar-based approaches is that language really consists of a series of grammatical forms and structures that can be acquired successively. That is why Michael mentioned earlier that it's really highly mechanical, meaning to say that the use of the learned structure or the form is based on controlled practice, meaning to say that students really are robbed, okay, the opportunity to really freely use the language. So there is this lack of free oral production in this kind of approach to language teaching, and that um, most of the advocates of this kind of approach is that grammar teaching is viewed as a deductive and linear presentation of the rules. So when you say deductive, you have already learned that, and then the linear presentation, meaning to say it's really pasunod, okay? Meaning to say that ito muna ang iuunahin natin kasi ito yung pinaka-importante, and then the next, and then the next, and then the next, which is not really the case, because when students use the language, they don't simply use, ito when I communicate, I will just use infinitives. And then I cannot say anything because I didn't learn that yet. Okay. So it's not like that. It's not a linear fashion. It's usually combination of different structures to be used in certain communicative situations. Um, Although some scholars really emphasize that while there is a substantial evidence that grammar instruction results in learning as measured by discrete point language tests, for example, the grammar test in TOEFL or other international tests, there is much less evidence to show that it leads to the kind of learning that enables learners to perform the targeted form in free oral production. That's why it's very it's kind of off to say that really we need to present or we need to teach grammar structures in a in a linear way, because as Ellis et al. Mentioned here, that what they have learned inside the classroom or how they're actually learned in the classroom do not match how the students are actually using it outside, or how learners actually build their grammar. Okay. So Ellis 2002 also clarified that the real stuff about language acquisition, not neglecting the importance of ano ha. So here the contention of Ellis in that particular slide is not to really deny the role of explicit instruction. Okay, so Ellis is really right in saying that the real stuff about language acquisition is the slow acquisition of form function mapping. Okay, so you can understand that it takes time for students to really absorb and master, okay, one structure particularly. And this skill, like others, takes tens of thousands of hours of practice that cannot be substituted by provision of few declarative rules. So you have here the contention that is very clear that there should be constant exposure, and exposure allows students to really practice the use of that structure. Although even if the students seem to master, again, I mentioned this one, the grammatical rule introduced in the classroom through the discrete tests that you know, the multiple choice test, the very traditional way, you can see they got perfect score or less errors or mistakes in the examination. But when they go out, they cannot apply all of those learnings. Okay, so that is what Ellis is trying to say here. It really requires tens of thousands of hours of practice, okay, before they will able to fully grasp, okay, the use of that structure in communicative situations. And so Ellis 2006 about PPP argues that practice and presentation is just one of the many ways to teach grammar. So one of the downsides of the PPP is that um it's very idealistic, that it believes on the cliche saying that practice makes perfect. Okay, practice makes perfect because it heavily gives importance on practice, okay, to really for students to really gain control of the structure. And that other scholars like Skehan mentioned before that the the evidence in support of such approach to the PPP is really unimpressive. That's the term of scan, that it's really unimpressive. So the levels of attainment in conventional language learning are really poor, and they have observed that commonly students leave school with very little in the way of usable language. So this is something to do with what Michael mentioned earlier. Na probably they have the opportunities to really use it, but since it's highly mechanical, since it's under grammar based approach, still students could not, okay, maximize the use of the language or really apply, okay, not really apply the use of that structure learned during the presentation and practice. Okay, so it's very idealistic, okay, and impressionistic kasi they really think that through practice they will really gain mastery of the use of the language. Okay, and it is highly popular and favored by many language teachers. The reason why is because it's really easy to use, it's really easy to organize and to evaluate, okay? And that the teachers are really in full control, okay, in full control of the structures intended to be covered. Okay, kasi nagpa-follow lang siya sa structure three-stage sequence. So the teacher has just the full control. And it was mentioned earlier by Michael that it's somewhat routinary or somewhat very planned. Okay, it's very planned kasi there is this only framework, okay, that they follow. You present the structure, and then you have practice activities, and then you have the production. Even if there is a production part there, okay, it doesn't really show the complex nature of language, even if it exposes students to communicate or to communicate through real world tasks, because their minds are conditioned with the structures presented only. So they'll become conscious in a way that they will just probably substitute or replace the words in the sentences that that they have been taught during the lesson, and they will repetitively use that. Okay, or the students are just really caged in using that structure in the production stage. So they don't really have the opportunity to make use of other structures or aspects of the language. Kasi for example, if yung prompt niya na-focus lang to, for example, it's just a Q&A kind of communicative situation, response should be contextualized within that usage of the structure. So production talaga siya, it exposes students to communicate, pero it's very limiting, okay? Very limiting on the part of the students. Again, this is highly favored by many language teachers all over the world because it is very easy to use and follow, okay? Kasi you have already the structure there, presentation, practice, and production. So nakikita niyo to sa lesson plan, I think, right? Even in lesson plans, the PPP model is reflected. Okay, we start with the motivation as the motivation, and then it follows the presentation, and then the practice, and then the production, which is the assessment part. Okay, so makikita mo talaga siya na it's highly favored by many language teachers or even institutions. Okay, now let's talk about communicative based approaches. So the communicative approach is basically a reaction to Noam Chomsky's characterization of language, right? Language competency. That's mainly the linguistic competence. So ito talaga siya was really created as a reaction to Chomsky's. Kasi alam mo naman, parang mga normal people din sila, ay naku, hindi naman yan maganda kasi ganito, hinahanapan nila ng mga loopholes.